Get comfortable. Let your breathing slow. The Elder Scrolls is one of the most densely built fantasy universes in the history of gaming. Beneath the surface of its mountains and dungeons and political intrigues lies a cosmological framework of extraordinary depth and strangeness. A creation mythology that takes seriously the question of what it means for a world to exist. A history that spans from before the concept of time had any meaning to the specific crisis of dragons returning to Skyrim, and a philosophy of existence that becomes more unusual and more rewarding the further into it you go. Tonight we follow the entire timeline, from before the beginning to the very end of what is known. Let us start where all things start, in the dark, before anything was. The void and the first distinction. Before the Elder Scrolls universe had a cosmos, it had two things, Anu and Padomay. These are not gods. They are not beings in any sense that maps cleanly onto what we mean by person or entity. They are principles, the two fundamental qualities from which everything else will eventually be derived. Anu is stasis, light, and the tendency toward order and permanence. Padomay is change, darkness, and the tendency toward motion and destruction. Neither is good, neither is evil. They are simply the two directions that existence can lean. From their interaction, their coexistence in the void, their qualities brushing against each other in the emptiness, something emerged. The interaction of Anu and Padomay produced a realm called the Orbis, the space between stasis and change, and the place where the tension between the two principles generates something more complicated than either principle alone. This is the first thing the Elder Scrolls tells you about its universe, that existence itself is the product of a tension. That what is real is what happens when the tendency toward permanence and the tendency toward change negotiate with each other. The Orbis is not a stable thing. It is a dynamic process. It is the ongoing negotiation between two incompatible qualities and everything that exists within it. Every god, every mortal, every world is a moment in that negotiation. From Anu and Padomay also came their respective souls, Anwi-El and Sithis. Anwi-El would eventually produce the Aedra and the mortal world. Sithis is associated with the void, and with the void capitalized, that underlies all of existence and into which things that truly end dissolve. These are not quite beings either. They are the concentrated essences of what their progenitors represent, made specific enough to interact with the things that come after them. In the Orbis, entities began to coalesce from the ambient energies of Anu and Padomay's interaction. These entities are called the Aedra, the original spirits, and they are the raw material from which everything that follows will be constructed. Some align with Anu's qualities, some align with Padomay's. All of them exist in a state of extraordinary power and extraordinary possibility. Among them, two are most significant, Oriel and Lorkhan. Oriel, called Oriel by some, later worshipped as a god of light and time by the elves, is an Anuic spirit of great power. He is associated with time itself, with the linear quality of existence that transforms the eternal negotiation of Anu and Padomay into a sequence of moments that can be understood and experienced. He is, in a sense, the spirit of history, of the idea that things happen in order, that before and after have meaning. Lorkhan is different. He is Padomaic. aligned with change and motion rather than stasis and permanence. He is the wanderer among the Aedra, the one who moves through the orbis observing what exists and conceiving of what might exist instead. And what he conceives of is Mundus, the creation of the world. Lorkhan looks at the Aedra in their eternal existence in the orbis. Beings of extraordinary power, immortal, capable of anything, existing in the limitless space between Anu and Padomay. And he sees a problem. Or perhaps he sees an opportunity. Or perhaps, given what he is, he simply sees a change that wants to happen and applies himself to making it happen. His idea is Mundus, the mortal plane, a world at the center of the Orbi, a hub around which the other realms would organize, where spirits could enter and experience something fundamentally different from their eternal existence. Limitation, mortality, change, the experience of being small and finite in a cosmos that is large and permanent. The Elder Scrolls literature is deliberately ambiguous about Lorkhan's motivations. Different cultures within the universe interpret him differently. The elves, whose divine ancestors were diminished by the creation of the mortal world, tend to view him as a deceiver, a trickster who convinced or manipulated the other Aedra into sacrificing themselves for a project that served his own purposes. The humans of Tamriel tend to view him more favorably, as a hero who gave them a world in which to exist, or at worst a flawed visionary whose means were questionable, but whose creation was genuine. What is agreed upon is this: Lorkhan convinced, or tricked, depending on the tradition, the other Aedra to contribute their essence to the creation of Mundus. The creation required sacrifice. The Aedra who participated gave up portions of their infinite selves to form the laws and substance of the physical world. They became diminished in the process. Some gave so much that they were unable to return to their former state and became the Aedra, the gods, the ancestors of mortals, beings of great power, but no longer the limitless entities they had been. Others refused to participate. They kept their full essence and became the Daedra, the Daedric princes who exist in Oblivion, the realm outside Mundus, with all their original power intact. The distinction between Aedra and Daedra in the Elder Scrolls is not primarily a distinction between good and evil. It is a distinction between those who gave and those who did not. The Aedra sacrificed themselves for the world's creation. The Daedra, for whatever reasons, declined. Among those who participated in the creation, many gave so much of themselves that they did not survive as individual entities. They became the Elnofe, the earth bones, the laws of nature that govern Mundus. Every consistent rule of the physical world, every reliable relationship between cause and effect, every law of gravity and thermodynamics and magic, these are the remnants of Aedra, who gave themselves so completely to the world's creation that they became the world's structure. This is one of the Elder Scrolls universe's most unusual pieces of cosmological design. The laws of nature are not simply rules that govern the world. They are the remains of beings who chose, or were persuaded, to become those rules. When magic operates consistently, when fire always burns and ice always freezes, it does so because something that was once capable of choice gave up that capacity to ensure the consistency. The convention and the punishment of Lorkhan. When the creation of Mundus was complete and the surviving Aedra could survey what had been built, the reaction among the Aedra was mixed. Some were content with what they had made. Others were furious at what the creation had cost them. The most furious was Oriel. Oriel called the surviving Aedra together at the Adamantine Tower, the first and oldest structure ever built on Mundus, a spike of reality on what would eventually become the island of Balfira in High Rock. This gathering is called the Convention, and at the Convention, the Aedra judged Lorkhan. What exactly was decided at the Convention is one of the things the Elder Scrolls deliberately keeps ambiguous across different cultural traditions. What is generally agreed is that Lorkhan was punished. His divine center, his heart, the physical locus of his divine essence, was removed from him and shot across Tamriel by Oriel's bow. It landed in Morrowind, where it sank beneath the earth and became the source of the power beneath Red Mountain. Lorkhan's divine center, removed from his body and embedded in the earth of the world he created, would continue to matter for thousands of years. The Dwemer would find it. The Tribunal would use it. The events of Morrowind, one of the series' greatest games, revolve around a divine heart that has been pumping beneath a volcano for longer than recorded history. Lorkhan himself, what was left of him without his heart, is variously described as being transformed, scattered, or continuing in some diminished form. He is worshipped in different ways by different human cultures. The Nords call him Shor and regard him as the true god of mankind. The Imperials call him Shezar and see him as a protector. In all traditions, he is associated with humanity and with the sacrifice that made the mortal world possible. Whether the judgment at Convention was just, whether Lorkhan deceived the Aedra into something they would not have chosen freely, or whether the creation was a genuine gift that the Aedra are simply too proud to acknowledge, is a question the Elder Scrolls never fully answers. It holds both possibilities simultaneously, because the universe it depicts was built on exactly this kind of ambiguity. A world that exists because of either a noble sacrifice or a great deception, and possibly both at once. The Dawn Era and the problem of time. The period before Mundus was established and before the Convention took place is called the Dawn Era. And the Dawn Era has a specific quality that distinguishes it from everything that comes after. Time did not work during it. This is not simply a poetic description of a distant mythological past. The Elder Scrolls lore is specific about it. In the Dawn Era, before the Aedra created the laws of Mundus, and before the linear quality of time was stabilized, causality operated differently. Events did not happen in sequence. They did not have before and after in any way that maps onto how we experience time. The Dawn Era has a narrative, but the narrative is not a timeline. It is a description of relationships between events that existed simultaneously in a way that linear time cannot capture. This produces a specific consequence for the cosmological history. The creation myths of the Elder Scrolls are not wrong about what happened. They simply describe events that were not sequential in the way that later events are sequential. The conflict between Oriel and Lorkhan, the creation of Mundus, the Convention. These things happened, but in a mode of happening that the mortal mind cannot fully model. The Dawn Era ends, or perhaps the process that produces what we call the Dawn Era concludes, when the Convention stabilizes Mundus and the laws of time take hold. From this point forward, events happen in sequence. Before and after have meaning. History becomes possible. The Merethic era begins. The Adamantine Tower and the nature of the towers. The Adamantine Tower, the structure at the convention, the oldest building in the world, is one instance of a concept that runs throughout Elder Scrolls lore. The towers. Each major civilization in Tamriel's history has a tower, a structure that serves as the metaphysical anchor of that civilization's reality. The towers were built in part by the Aedra during the creation of Mundus to help stabilize the newly formed world, to drive stakes into the ground of reality and prevent the chaos of the Dawn era from reasserting itself. Each tower has a stone, a focal object that contains the tower's purpose and power. The Adamantine Tower's stone is said to be the convention itself, the act of the gods gathering and establishing the laws of Mundus. Red Mountain in Morrowind has Lorkhan's heart as its stone. White Gold Tower in the Imperial City has its own stone. Crystal-like lore. The Crystal Tower of the Ultima on Somerset Isle was one of the most powerful until it was destroyed. The towers matter in Elder Scrolls lore because of what happens when they fall. When a tower's stone is removed or its purpose is subverted, the reality that the tower anchors becomes unstable. The history of Tamriel is partly the history of towers being built, maintained, threatened, and occasionally destroyed, and the consequences of those threats and destructions rippling through the civilizations that depended on them. The birth of the races and the coming of the elves. After the Dawn era, and with linear time established, the world of Nirn, the mortal plane created through the sacrifice of the Aedra began to fill with life. The original inhabitants of Tamriel were what the lore calls beast folk. The pre-literate, pre-civilizational ancestors of the Khajiit, the Argonians, the Goblinkin and other races that live in the margins of the world, the later civilizations would build. These beast folk are not primitive in the sense of being simple. They are simply different. Beings whose relationship to the world was not organized around the same concerns that would later dominate. They lived in pre-literate communities across all of Tamriel, in the jungles and marshes and mountains, for an enormous stretch of time before the first elves arrived. The elves, the Mer, came from the west. Specifically, they came from Aldmeris, a continent that is now lost, sunk beneath the sea, or otherwise gone, leaving only its name and the memory of its people. The Aldmer, the ancestors of all the elven races, left Aldmeris and arrived in Tamriel during the early Merethic era, and establishing their first settlements on the Somerset Isles before spreading inland. They were, by the standards of the time, extraordinarily sophisticated. The Aldmer brought writing, advanced magic, and complex political structures to a Tamriel, where the existing inhabitants had none of these things. They drove the beast folk into the margins, into the jungles of Elsewhere and the swamps of Black Marsh, and the mountains of other peripheral regions. Not through a single military campaign, but through the accumulated pressure of a more technologically advanced civilization, gradually asserting itself over the space of centuries. And then, over thousands of years, the Aldmer changed. The splitting of the elves. The Aldmer who settled in Tamriel did not remain a single people. The different environments they settled in had the different philosophical and religious developments they experienced, and the different choices they made over generations produced distinct cultures that eventually became distinct races. The Altmer, the High Elves, remained closest to the original Aldmeri culture. They settled the Somerset Isles, maintained their traditional connection to the Aedra and to the high culture of Aldmeris, and became the most politically and magically sophisticated of the elven peoples. The Bosmer, the Wood Elves, settled Valenwood, the great forest of the south, and adapted to their environment in ways that took them in a very different direction from the sophisticated court culture of the Altmer. Their relationship with nature, the specific, sacred relationship formalized in the Green Pact, which forbids the Bosmer from harming the vegetation of Valenwood or eating anything but meat, is a consequence of who they became in that specific place. The Dwemer, also called dwarves, though they were not short, settled underground. They were a free-thinking, reclusive group of Aldmer devoted to what their culture described as the secrets of science and alchemy and engineering, but which was, at its core, a philosophical project of extraordinary ambition. The Dwemer were trying to understand the fundamental nature of reality in ways that the Aedra-worshipping Altmer found blasphemous. They questioned the gods. They questioned the creation. And they pursued their questions into underground cities of extraordinary sophistication, carving their civilization into the mountains of Morrowind and Skyrim, and beneath the notice and the reach of those who might have stopped them. The Chimera were different from both. A group of Aldmer who followed a prophet named Veloth. They turned away from the Aldmeri cultural tradition entirely, away from the worship of the Aedra, whom they considered distant and inaccessible, toward the Daedra, who were immediate and responsive and willing to interact directly with mortals. Under Veloth's guidance, the Chimera settled the land that would become Morrowind, living alongside and in perpetual tension with the Dwemer, who had preceded them there. And there were others, the former, who eventually became the Snow Elves of Skyrim, driven underground by the Nords who came later and changed over millennia into something barely recognizable as their former selves. And the Orsimer, the Orcs, who began as something else entirely. The story of how an Aldmer became an Orc is one of the stranger tales in the entire Elder Scrolls mythology. The transformation of Trinimac. Among the Et-Ada, who participated in the creation of Mundus, among the spirits who became the Aedra, Trinimac was one of the most powerful warriors. He was the champion of Auriel, the defender of Aldmeri tradition, the spirit most opposed to the Velothi movement that would take the Chimera out of Aldmeri civilization. Trinimac confronted Veloth's journey. The Daedric Prince Boethia, one of the Daedra who had not participated in the creation of Mundus and who had retained full divine power, intervened. What happened next is described differently in different traditions, but the common thread is this. Boethia defeated Trinimac in some profound and fundamental way. Not simply killed him, changed him, consumed him, according to some accounts, literally ate Trinimac and spoke with his voice, corrupting and humiliating him in front of his followers. And then, when Boethia had done what he intended, expelled what was left. What came out was no longer Trinimac. It was Malakath, a diminished, changed, bitter Daedric prince associated with outcasts, with the spurned, with those whom society has rejected and left behind. Trinimac's followers, the Aldmer who had fought to prevent the Velothi exodus, were similarly transformed. They became the Orsimer, the pariah folk, the Orcs. The Orcs carry in their culture the memory of this transformation. Malakath is their patron, and his character, his specific divine identity as the god of those who have been cast out, reflects what happened to Trinimac. The Orcs are, in a mythological sense, a people defined by a god's failure and transformation. The Merethic era settles into history. With the elves established across Tamriel and the beastfolk pushed to the margins, the Merethic era took on the quality of a world still being established. The Dwemer built their underground cities and pursued their philosophical experiments. The Chimer settled Morrowind and developed their ancestor worship traditions under the influence of the Daedra. The Altmer maintained their sophisticated high culture on Somerset. The Aelids, the Heartland High Elves, flourished in the jungles of what would become Cyrodiil, are practicing their own form of Daedra worship and building the White Gold Tower. And then the humans came, from the northern continent of Admora, a land that has since become too cold and too hostile to support civilization. Humans crossed the Sea of Ghosts and arrived in Skyrim. They were the Atmorans, and their first contact with the elves of Tamriel was, for a time, peaceful. The Atmorans settled the northern city of Sarthor. They built a life in a land that was already the home of others. And in the ruins of Sarthor they found something. What they found beneath Sarthor would not be fully understood for thousands of years. It was an artifact of immense power, something connected to the fundamental forces that stabilized reality. And its discovery would trigger the first great catastrophe of human presence in Tamriel. The elves learned what the Atmorans had found, and on the night that would be remembered as the Night of Tears, they came for it. Sleep well. The story is only beginning. The timeline stretches long ahead of us, and there is much more to come. Welcome back. Let everything slow. The Night of Tears. Isgramor and his people had built Sarthor, the first great human city in Skyrim, in the northern lands of Tamriel. For a time, the Atmorans and the Snow Elves who lived there existed in something approaching peace. Two peoples in the same land, managing the tension of proximity through whatever negotiations and accommodations early civilizations manage. Beneath Sarthor, the Atmorans found something. The Elder Scrolls lore calls it the Eye of Magnus, an artifact of immense metaphysical significance, connected to the fundamental forces that stabilized reality when Magnus, the architect of Mundus, fled back to Aetherius during the world's creation. What exactly the Eye of Magnus is, what it does, what it represents, why it was there, is one of the questions that spans the entire Elder Scrolls series and is only partially answered even by the events of Skyrim thousands of years later. The Snow Elves learned what was beneath Sarthor, and they were afraid. Whether their fear was justified, whether the Atmorans were doing something dangerous with what they had found, or whether the Snow Elves simply could not trust a human civilization in possession of something so powerful, is something the lore deliberately leaves ambiguous. The Nordic tradition says the attack was unprovoked malice, Elven scholars note that Ysgramor may have been responsible for provocations that the Nordic accounts omit. What is not disputed is what happened. On the night that would be called the Night of Tears, the Snow Elves attacked Sarthor. They burned it. They killed everyone they could find. They believed they had killed all the humans, that no one was left to carry news of what had been done, no one to return with vengeance. They were wrong. Ysgramor survived. His 2 sons, Ingol and Ilgar, survived. 3 people escaped the burning of Sarthor and crossed the Sea of Ghosts back to Atmora with the story of what had been done. And Ysgramor, in Atmora, gathered his response. 500 warriors, give or take. The Nordic tradition calls them the 500 companions, and the list of their names, preserved in the Feast of the Dead, recited by skalds across the centuries, is one of the stranger documents in the Elder Scrolls library. Ysgramor himself led them, wielding his legendary axe Wuthrad, whose name means Storm's Tears in Atmoran. They crossed back to Skyrim. They landed at the place called Sarik Head. And then they began a war against the Snow Elves that would not end until the Snow Elves were functionally destroyed as a civilization. The specific tragedy of the Snow Elves' fate is not simply that they lost. It is what happened to the survivors. The fate of the Falmer. Not all Snow Elves were killed in the war Ysgramor brought to Skyrim. A significant number survived, including, eventually, a group large enough to need refuge from the human conquest. Hunted, displaced, desperately seeking safety, they turned to the only other civilization present, the Dwemer. The Dwemer agreed to provide sanctuary, deep underground, in the realm of Blackreach, and the vast underground cities the Dwemer had built beneath the mountains. The Snow Elf refugees were given safety. What they were given alongside it was concealed until it was too late to refuse. The Dwemer required the Snow Elves to eat a specific fungus, a food of the underground, grown in the Dwemer caverns. They were told it was sustenance for their new environment. What it was something that destroyed their eyesight over generations. Blinded, dependent on the Dwemer for everything, the Snow Elves gradually lost the cultural continuity that would have let them remember what they had been. Over centuries, over generations of darkness and dependence, the Snow Elves became the Falmer, the blind, degenerated, violent creatures that the player encounters in Skyrim's underground. They are not simply monsters. They are a people who were systematically reduced to a state in which they could no longer be people. There is one exception, and discovered in the Dawnguard DLC of Skyrim, Knight Paladin Gelibor, a Snow Elf who found sanctuary in the Chapel of Oriel, rather than with the Dwemer, and who has maintained his original form and culture across the thousands of years since. He is a ghost in time, a living representative of what the Snow Elves were before the Farmer transformation. He has been alone in his sanctuary for millennia, tending the shrine of Oriel, waiting. The other Snow Elves who took sanctuary there were all killed long ago. He does not know this when you find him. The Dragon Cult and the Dragon War. While Ysgramor's campaign against the Snow Elves was transforming the north of Tamriel, something else was happening that would define Nordic culture for all of history. The Dragon Cult. The dragons of the Elder Scrolls universe are not simply large flying reptiles. They are beings of immense age and power, closely associated with the fundamental forces that created and sustain the world. The specific ability the dragons possess, the thum, the voice, the shout, is the original language of creation, the language in which the Aedra shaped Mundus, with words that do not simply describe things but change them. When a dragon speaks fire, the fire exists because the word for fire spoken by a being whose nature is aligned with creation makes fire real. The dragon cult was the religious and political structure that the dragons established in early Skyrim, and it was an arrangement of genuine power, not simple superstition. A dragon priest, human servants devoted to specific dragons, wielded extraordinary power in exchange for their service. The masks worn by dragon priests, which the player finds in tombs across Skyrim, are artifacts of genuine magical significance, still functional thousands of years after their wearers died. The dragons ruled, and the humans served. For an extended period, this was simply the arrangement. The Nords who came to Skyrim with Ysgramor were fierce and capable, but the dragons were categorically superior beings. The dragon cult had genuine theology, genuine power, and genuine enforcement capacity. The dragon priest did not serve simply out of fear. What changed? What produced the dragon war that overthrew dragon dominion in Skyrim was partly rebellion and partly a specific intervention. Kine, the goddess of the storms, took pity on the mortals who lived under dragon rule. She persuaded Paarthurnax, Alduin's own lieutenant, one of the most powerful dragons in existence, to betray his kin and teach the Nords to use the voice. This was not a simple defection. Paarthurnax was betraying his species and his nature in teaching mortals the language that was fundamentally a dragon capacity. The Nords who learned from him became the tongues, masters of the voice. And with this new power, they could fight the dragons on something closer to equal terms, but not equal enough. The dragon war was brutal and long, and the Nords were still losing when the tongues, in desperation, created something new. Dragonrend, a shout forged from the concept of mortality. A word that the dragons, as essentially immortal beings, they could not understand, and which forced them to experience the concept of ending. Dragonrend did not kill dragons. It grounded them, forced them to confront finitude, and made them vulnerable to the weapons that could then be brought to bear. With Dragonrend, the tide turned. The dragons were defeated. Alduin, the World Eater, the first and most powerful of the dragons, was not killed but cast forward in time by a specific application of the voice, sealed away until a future when he could be properly dealt with. The dragon war ended with the Nordic peoples free of dragon rule and in possession of the Thum as a cultural tradition. The Greybeards, the masters of the way of the voice who sit atop the throat of the world in Skyrim, are the inheritors of this tradition. The voice became sacred, as speaking it for mundane purposes became considered disrespectful, and Paarthurnax, who had made all of this possible, retreated to the throat of the world to meditate and practice what he preached. The specific discipline of not using power simply because you have it. He is still there in Skyrim, 3,000 years later, when the Dragonborn arrives. The First Era begins. The Merethic Era ends and the First Era begins with the founding of the Cameron dynasty in Valenwood, the establishment of a formal government among the Bosmer that marks the first year of recorded history in the Elder Scrolls calendar system. The year before this founding is ME1. The year of the founding is 1E1. The first era spans nearly 3,000 years and encompasses events of extraordinary scope. The rise and fall of human empires, the conflict that will destroy an entire civilization, and the political experiments that will eventually produce the stable governing structures of later eras. In the early First Era, the human civilizations that Ysgramor's conquest had established in the north were consolidating. The First Empire of the Nords, Ysgramor's legacy, extended Nordic influence south into High Rock and east into parts of Morrowind. The Aelids still controlled Cyrodiil, maintaining their sophisticated if deeply cruel civilization in the heartland of the continent, with the White Gold Tower as their center of power. And in the underground, the Dwemer were working. The Dwemer and the heart of Lorkhan. The Dwemer are one of the most fascinating civilizations in any fantasy universe, not because of their technology, though their technology is extraordinary, but because of their philosophy. The Dwemer were atheists, not simply skeptical of the gods in the way that some mortals are skeptical, but philosophically committed to the position that the divine was either non-existent or, if real, not worthy of worship. They lived in a world where magic demonstrably worked, where Daedric princes could be contacted and would respond, where the history of creation was not simply myth, but something that could be partially reconstructed from evidence. They knew the Etada were real. They knew the Aedra had created the world, and they rejected the implications. Their specific philosophical project was the investigation of the nature of reality, without the assumption that the divine was worthy of reverence. They wanted to understand how the world worked, not to worship the beings who had made it, but to comprehend the mechanisms and eventually to transcend them. The Dwemer were trying, in their specific underground way, to do something that the Daedra had done by declining to participate in creation, to maintain their full potential by refusing to give themselves to something external. When the Dwemer found Lorkhan's heart beneath Red Mountain, the divine center that Ariel had shot across Tamriel at the convention, which had landed in Morrowind and sunk beneath the mountain, they saw not a sacred relic, but a resource. Specifically, they saw the concentrated divine essence of a god as a power source. Kagrenak, the greatest of the Dwemer engineers and philosophers, developed 3 tools: Sunda, Keening, and Wraithguard, specifically for the purpose of working with the heart. Each tool served a different function in accessing the heart's power safely. Together, they allowed the Dwemer to harness what was essentially a piece of concentrated divinity for their own purposes. What they were building with that power was Numidium, the brass god, a mechanical construct of enormous size, designed to embody the Dwemer's theological project, to be their created god, answering to them, serving their purposes, a demonstration that divinity was a property that could be engineered rather than something that had to be worshipped. The Chimera, the Alliance, danned the Battle of Red Mountain, the Chimera, who had lived alongside the Dwemer in Morrowind for centuries in a relationship of mutual hostility, found themselves drawn into alliance with the Dwemer against an external threat. the first empire of the Nords, which was pushing into Morrowind. Nerevar, the greatest of the Chimera heroes, forged an alliance with the Dwemer king Dumak. Together, Chimera and Dwemer fought off the Nordic expansion and established a unified Morrowind, the First Council, that was remarkable for involving two peoples who had been enemies for most of their shared history. The alliance did not last. What broke it was the heart. Nerevar discovered what Kagrenac was doing, discovered that the Dwemer were using Lorkhan's divine essence to build a mechanical god, and was horrified. His counselors, and the three figures who would eventually become the Tribunal, urged specific actions. Nerevar went to Red Mountain to confront Dumak. What happened there is one of the most contested events in all of Elder Scrolls history. The Battle of Red Mountain produced the disappearance of an entire race. Every Dwemer in the world, every Dwemer on the surface of Tamriel, every Dwemer in the underground cities, every Dwemer on Vardenfell, vanished simultaneously. The only exception was Yagrumbagon, who had been in an outer realm at the moment of the disappearance and returned to find his people simply gone. He is the last living dwarf, encountered in Morrowind, enormous and deformed by the Corpus disease, still trying to understand what happened to everyone he knew. What the Dwemer's disappearance was, what Kagrenac's use of the tools on the heart actually did, is one of the great unsolved questions of the lore, and is deliberately maintained as such. Different in-world sources attribute it to different causes. Kagrenac's experimental interference with divine essence removed the Dwemer from the normal operation of Mundus. Whether they were transported somewhere else, whether they were incorporated into something, whether they simply ceased to exist in any meaningful sense, is not something the lore resolves, and any single answer would diminish the specific horror of the mystery. What is known? The moment the Dwemer disappeared, Kagrenac's tools became free to be used by others, and 3 Chimera were waiting to use them. The birth of the Tribunal, Vivek, Almalexia, and Ansothasil, the 3 Chimera who would become the Tribunal, the living gods of Morrowind, had heard Nerevar's oath that the heart of Lorkhan would never be used again, that Kagrenac's tools would be destroyed or sealed away. Nerevar had made this promise to his Daedric patrons, particularly to Azura. The 3 Chimera did not keep the oath. Whether Nerevar was already dead by the time the decision was made, whether he was killed in the battle, or killed afterward, or simply died of his wounds, is another contested question. The Ashlander traditions of Morrowind, preserved outside the official theological structure of the Tribunal Temple, maintain that the 3 Chimera killed Nerevar rather than let him prevent their use of the heart. The Tribunal Temple's official history says he died in battle and was mourned. The truth, and as with so much in the Elder Scrolls, is deliberately ambiguous. What is not disputed is the outcome. Vivek, Almalexia, and Sothasil used Kagrenac's tools on the heart of Lorkhan and made themselves gods, not the diminished Aedra, depleted by their contribution to creation, not the full but distant Daedra. They became something in between, beings of divine power, capable of miracles, sustained by the heart beneath Red Mountain, living on Nirn among their people. They became Almzivi, the 3-in-1 divine unity that would govern Morrowind for thousands of years, and Azura punished them for it. The Chimer's golden skin turned grey. Their golden eyes turned red. The beautiful golden-skinned Chimer became the ash-grey, red-eyed Dwemer, the dark elves, in a single moment of divine judgment. Azura cursed the three who had broken the oath and changed the people who would now be their followers. The Dwemer have been the Dwemer ever since. Grey skin, red eyes, the specific appearance of a people who carry in their biology the memory of a divine curse. Whether they consider this a punishment or a mark of distinction varies across Dwemeri culture, but the reason for it is one of the most significant single events in Elder Scrolls history. The Tribunal now ruled Morrowind, and Numidium, the brass god the Dwemer had been building, was left unfinished, waiting for whoever would eventually try to complete it. That person would come eventually, and when Numidium was finally completed and activated, it would break time itself. Sleep well. The timeline continues. There is much more ahead. Welcome back. Let everything slow. Alessia and the Ayleid Rebellion. While the Dwemer built their underground cities in the mountains of Morrowind, while the Chimer settled the land alongside them, while the Dragon War raged in the north, and the Snow Elves were transformed into the Falmer in the darkness beneath the earth, the Ayleids ruled Cyrodiil. The Ayleids were the Heartland High Elves. Aldmer, who had settled the jungles of central Tamriel, built the White Gold Tower as the center of their civilization, and gradually developed a culture that was, by the time of the First Era, characterized by Daedra worship and the keeping of human slaves. The Needs, the human ancestors of the imperial people, lived in Cyrodiil as property, so their existence was defined by service to Ayleid masters who regarded them with the specific contempt that a sophisticated civilization tends to develop for those it has decided are beneath consideration. A woman named Alessia changed this. She was a slave. She is known to history by many names. Al-Esh, which means High Highness in Old Aldmeri, corrupted over time into Alessia. Paravant, which means first of its kind. Escher, Perif, and others besides. She prayed at Sancretor, a sacred site in the Geralt Mountains, for freedom. Not just her own freedom, the freedom of all her people. Akatosh answered. The dragon god of time, the chief of the Aedra, appeared to Alessia at Sancretor and offered her a covenant. The terms were specific. As long as Alessia's bloodline held the ruby throne of Cyrodiil, and as long as the dragonfires burned in the White Gold Tower, Tamriel would be protected from large-scale Daedric incursion. Akatosh tore open his own divine heart and gave her the Amulet of Kings as the physical symbol of this covenant. Alessia also received help from another source, Pelinal Whitestrake, a figure of extraordinary violence and possible divine origin, who arrived to fight for the human cause. Pelinal was not simply a great warrior, he was something stranger, an entity whose origin the lore deliberately obscures, possibly a Shezarine, a mortal vessel of Lorkhan's ongoing presence in the world. He was characterized by the specific ferocity of a being who existed to fight elves and was very good at it. The rebellion began. With the support of the Nordic kingdoms of Skyrim, who joined Alessia's cause, and with rebel Ayleid lords who took the human side against their own people, the Alessian forces fought their way to the White Gold Tower. Pelinal Whitestrake, according to the tradition, stormed the tower alone and killed the sorcerer king Umaril the Unfeathered. Then Mori House, Alessia's demigod consort, the son of Cain, led the rest of the army in to take the citadel. In 1 E 243, Alessia declared herself the first empress of Cyrodiil. The Aelids were driven out of their heartland. Many fled to Valenwood, where some Aelid lords persisted for centuries before their civilization finally faded from Tamriel entirely. The White Gold Tower became the seat of human power in Tamriel. Alessia understood that her new empire needed a religion that could unite people of different traditions. The Nords who had helped her worshipped their own pantheon. The Cyrodiilic peoples had developed their own practices. Some of the Aelid lords who had allied with her brought elven traditions. She created the 8 Divines, a synthetic pantheon that combined elements of Nordic and Elven theology into a single framework that all could participate in, with Akatosh as its head. The 8 would later become 9 when Tiber Septim achieved apotheosis. Alessia died in 1 E 266, and the tradition says she was visited on her deathbed by both Pelinal Whitestrake and the divine presence of Akatosh himself. Her soul was placed within the red diamond at the heart of the Amulet of Kings, where it would rest alongside the souls of all her imperial descendants. The Amulet of Kings was not simply a piece of jewelry. It was a vessel for the accumulated divine weight of the bloodline that had made a covenant with the dragon god of time. The Alessian Order and the Middle Dawn. The empire Alessia built lasted for over 2,000 years. In that time, many things happened. Rulers came and went, borders expanded and contracted, wars were fought and concluded. But one internal development deserves specific attention: the Alessian Order. The order began with a prophet named Maruch, who claimed to have received visions from Saint Alessia herself. His theology was increasingly monotheistic and increasingly hostile to elven culture and tradition. Under his teachings, the idea that the elves were not fit to rule, that the divine order was specifically human, became the foundation of a religious movement that gradually took control of the empire's theological structures. By 1 E 361, the Alessian Order's doctrines had been formally adopted by the empire. The arch-prelates of the order wielded power comparable to the emperor's. The specific extremity of their theology, the removal of elven elements from the divine, the increasingly abstract and inaccessible depiction of the divine, the political enforcement of religious conformity, made the Alessian Order one of the more interesting studies in how religious institutions evolve when they acquire state power. The Order's secret sect, the Marukati Selective, eventually performed a ritual that broke time itself. In what is called the Middle Dawn, a period somewhere around 1 E 1200, though the dates are inherently uncertain because time was broken, the Marukati Selective, attempting to remove the elven quality from the concept of Akatosh as they understood it, performed a ritual that caused a dragon break. A dragon break is what happens when the linear quality of time, the specific quality that Akatosh, the dragon god of time, maintains in Mundus, is disrupted. When time breaks, events occur simultaneously rather than sequentially. Multiple contradictory outcomes happen at once. The world continues, but its continuity is compromised. The Middle Dawn lasted for approximately 1008 years, a millennium in which time was non-functional. The texts that survive from this period are contradictory in ways that cannot be resolved, because they describe events that happened in multiple orders simultaneously. When the dragon break resolved and linear time reasserted itself, Tamriel found itself in the aftermath of 1,000 years that could not be properly remembered or historicized. The Alessian Empire eventually collapsed in 1E 2331, brought down by the internal contradictions of an order that had grown too powerful and too rigid, and had finally exhausted the Empire's capacity to sustain it. Cyrodiil fragmented, the order was dissolved, and for centuries no single power united the continent. Rayman Cyrodiil and the Second Empire. Into the fragmentation of post-Alessian Tamriel came the Akaviri. Akavir is the continent to the east of Tamriel, home to several civilizations that have interacted with Tamriel at various points in history. The most significant Akaviri invasion came in 1E 2703, when a force of Akaviri warriors, specifically the Saishi, a race described as snake people who had consumed the other humans of their continent, arrived in Tamriel and began advancing into Skyrim, High Rock, and eventually Cyrodiil. They were not defeated militarily in any conventional sense. They were stopped at the Battle of Pale Pass in Cyrodiil, when a figure named Rayman Cyrodiil met them. The accounts of what happened are extraordinary. Rayman, a warrior of exceptional power and divine lineage, used the Thu'um against the Akaviri forces. The Akaviri, who were searching for a Dragonborn, a being with the specific divine quality that the dragon god of time had blessed Alessia's bloodline with, recognized in Rayman what they had been looking for, and they laid down their weapons and swore fealty. The Akaviri invasion became the Akaviri integration. Rayman incorporated the Taishi warriors into his forces, absorbed their military traditions into imperial culture, and used this new combined strength to establish the Second Empire. The Rayman dynasty would govern Tamriel for centuries, ruling over every province except Morrowind, which the Tribunal's divine governance made effectively impregnable to external conquest. The Second Empire ended not in battlefield defeat, but in assassination. The last Rayman emperor was killed by the Morag Tong, the guild of sanctioned assassins operating in Morrowind, whose writs of execution were considered legal under Dwemer law. The Akaviri potentate who ruled afterward was likewise assassinated decades later, and Tamriel fractured again. The interregnum followed. Approximately 400 years of political chaos in which no single power controlled Cyrodiil, in which alliances formed and dissolved, in which the events of the Elder Scrolls Online take place. It was the longest period of imperial absence in the historical record, and it ended only when a general from High Rock organized a conquest that would unite the entire continent for the first and only time. Tiber Septim and the Numidium. His name, before he became what history calls him, was Yalti Earlybeard. He was a young general in the service of the Colovian king Cuchulainn, fighting in the wars that eventually reunited Cyrodiil. When Cuchulainn was assassinated, Yalti, now calling himself Tiber Septim, took the title of emperor and continued the conquest that his former patron had begun. Tiber Septim was, by any measure, one of the most capable individuals in the history of Tamriel. He was a military genius. He was a political operator of exceptional skill. He was, like Alessia before him, a Dragonborn, born with the innate ability to absorb and use the voice in ways that took others years of practice to achieve. He was charismatic in the way that people who reshape history tend to be. Not simply pleasant, but capable of making those around him believe that what he intended was what should happen. He also had something no one else had had for a very long time. Numidium, the brass god, the unfinished mechanical construct the Dwemer had been building from Lorkhan's heart, had been in possession of the Tribunal for the millennia since the Battle of Red Mountain. They had not activated it, but they had maintained it. When the Tribunal eventually gave it to Tiber Septim, as part of an agreement that recognized his conquest and preserved Morrowind's autonomy under the armistice, he had in his possession the most powerful weapon in Tamriel's history. With Numidium operational, powered by a gem called the Mantella, which contained the soul of his imperial battle mage Zurin Arctus, Tiber Septim completed his conquest of Tamriel. Provinces that had resisted every previous emperor fell before the brass god. The Red Guards of Hammerfell, fierce warriors who had defeated every other attacker, could not stand against it. The High Rock petty kingdoms, the Bosmer of Valenwood, the Khajiit of Elsewhere, all were brought into the empire. In 896, Tiber Septim was crowned Emperor of all of Tamriel. He declared the end of the Second Era and the beginning of the Third. No one before him had unified the entire continent. No one after him would manage it again. When he died, after ruling for 38 years as undisputed Emperor following his unification, totaling 81 years of life, he did not simply die. He achieved apotheosis. Tiber Septim became Talos, the ninth divine, added to the 8 that Alessia had established. A mortal who became a god. A human general whose conquest was so complete that the divine weight of it elevated him to the same status as the Aedra, who had created the world he conquered. The Thalmor, the supremacist elven organization that would dominate the Fourth Era, regard the worship of Talos as the most dangerous heresy in existence, and their specific objection is theological. They maintain that a mortal cannot become a god, that the concept of Talos as divine is false, and that the amulet of kings and the covenant it represented was a manipulation. Whether they are correct, whether Tiber Septim genuinely achieved divinity, or whether his veneration is the accumulated weight of a conquered civilization's need for a sacred founder, is one of the Elder Scrolls' most deliberate ambiguities. He is worshipped across Tamriel regardless of what the Thalmor believe. His temples were not burned out of the faith of those who built them. And in Skyrim, thousands of years later, his worship is the fault line along which a civil war runs. The Numidium and the Dragon Break. The use of Numidium to conquer Tamriel was not without consequences. And activating a construct powered by a piece of divine essence, by the concentrated metaphysical weight of Lorkhan's own divinity, does things to the structure of time. Numidium caused a dragon break. The specific dragon break associated with Numidium's activation during the events of Daggerfall, which occurs much later, is the most thoroughly documented. The warp in the west. in which multiple contradictory outcomes of the game's choices all happen simultaneously. But the use of Numidium by Tiber Septim also left marks on the historical record. Accounts that cannot be reconciled, dates that do not align, events that different sources place in incompatible sequences. When the dragon breaks, history becomes uncertain. Multiple things are true simultaneously. What this means for the timeline of Tamriel's history is that even the periods we think we understand best, the age of Tiber Septim, the founding of the Third Empire, contain within them irresolvable contradictions that are not the result of poor record keeping, but of time itself having been disrupted. The world that emerges from a dragon break is a world that contains more possibilities than it should. A world in which the usual rules of linear causality have been suspended long enough for multiple futures to partially coexist before collapsing into a single present. Tamriel, in the Third Era, was that kind of world. More complicated than it appeared, more contradictory than any history could fully capture. Sleep well. The Third Era is beginning, and with it come the events that the games themselves depict. Welcome back. Let everything settle. The Third Empire and the Long Peace. With Tiber Septim's conquest complete, and all of Tamriel united under the banner of the Third Empire, the continent entered a period of relative stability that would last for generations. The Septim dynasty governed from the imperial city. The provinces maintained their autonomy within the imperial framework. Trade flowed. The Mages Guild provided magical services across provincial borders. The Fighters Guild contracted to those who needed protection. The Thieves Guild operated in the margins, as it always had. This is the Tamriel that the Elder Scrolls games mostly inhabit. A world that has had centuries to settle into the shape that Tiber Septim gave it. A world that still carries the scars of everything that came before, but is also, for most of its inhabitants, simply where they live. The grand cosmological history, the Dawn Era, the Aedra, the Dragon War, the Dwemer, the Tribunal, is the past. What the farmers of Cyrodiil and the merchants of Morrowind deal with daily is taxes, weather, guild politics, and whatever local crisis has arrived. The Third Empire was not without its troubles. Emperors were assassinated. Plague swept provinces. The Dark Brotherhood operated. Usurpers attempted and failed. But the structural stability that Tiber Septim had established through conquest and covenant held across centuries. Held because the dragonfires burned in the White Gold Tower, and as long as they burned, the agreement between Akatosh and Alessia protected Tamriel from the worst of what Oblivion might otherwise send. What was happening in Morrowind during this long peace, however, was something that would eventually force events that the entire continent would feel. Dagoth wakes. When the Tribunal made themselves gods using Kagranak's tools on the heart of Lorkhan, Vorin Dagoth, who had been left to guard the heart after the Battle of Red Mountain, was killed by the Tribunal when they came for the tools. This is at least what some accounts say. Others say he was simply driven off. The ambiguity is deliberate. What is not ambiguous is what happened in 2E 882. Dagoth Vorin Dagoth, transformed by centuries of proximity to the heart into something new, woke up, not simply from sleep. He woke into a different state of existence, having bound himself to the heart of Lorkhan during the long darkness. He and the other lords of House Dagoth, who had been thought destroyed, returned. They seized the heart chamber beneath Red Mountain. When the Tribunal came for their annual renewal of power, the ritual pilgrimage they made each year to restore the divine strength they drew from Lorkhan's divine essence. They found the heart chamber occupied. Dagoth drove them off. And for the first time since the Battle of Red Mountain, the Tribunal were cut off from the source of their divinity. This was a slow catastrophe. The Tribunal did not immediately lose their divine power. What they had accumulated over centuries could sustain them for some time, but it could not be renewed. Every year without access to the heart was a year of slow diminishment. The Tribunal became weaker. Dagoth drawing directly from the heart, became stronger. From beneath Red Mountain, a Dagoth began to extend his influence. The blight, a supernatural disease that crossed the mountains of Vardenfell like weather, began to spread. Ash creatures and corpus infected victims spread outward from the mountain. The Ghost Fence, a great barrier of divine power that the Tribunal erected to contain the spread, held but consumed enormous amounts of the power they could no longer replenish. What Dagoth was building beneath the mountain was a Lorkhan, the second Numidium, his own brass god, powered by the heart of Lorkhan, which would, once complete and activated, allow him to drive the Empire from Morrowind and reassert Dwemer independence under his specific vision of what that independence should be. His plan was not simply conquest. It was, in his mind, liberation. Whether Dagoth was a genuine idealist who believed in what he was building, or whether the centuries of exposure to the heart had produced a sophisticated madness that resembled ideology without being it, is one of the questions Morrowind asks and does not fully answer. The Tribunal diminished. For 4 centuries, the Tribunal struggled against a situation that had no good resolution. They could not access the heart to renew their power. They could not defeat Dagoth while he was sustained by the heart. Any damage they inflicted was reversed by his divine connection. They could not admit to their people the truth of the situation without destroying the theological structure that Morrowind's entire society was built on. The Tribunal disappeared from public life. The gods who had once walked among their people, who had been present and personal and responsive, became absent, known through their representatives in the temple, known through their relics and their writings, but not themselves present. The Dwemer of the 4th century of the Third Era prayed to gods who had retreated into silence. Dissident priests within the Tribunal temple began to speak uncomfortable truths. That the source of the Tribunal's divine power was the same heart that powered Dagoth that the Tribunal had used Kagranak's tools in violation of the oath they had sworn, that the Nerevarine prophecy, the Ashlanders' tradition that Nerevar would return to set things right, might be true after all. The temple persecuted these voices. Heresy is a more comfortable accusation than truth when the truth threatens the institution. The Nerevarine prophecy. Azura and the Daedric Prince of Dusk and Dawn had cursed the Tribunal for breaking their oath. She had also made a promise. Nerevar would be reincarnated. The wrong done at the Battle of Red Mountain Whatever it was, whatever version of events you believe, would be addressed. The specific shape this would take was encoded in the Nerevarine prophecy, a set of trials that the reincarnated Nerevar would fulfill, culminating in the defeat of Dagoth and the ending of the Blight. The Ashlanders, the nomadic Dwemer who had preserved the oldest traditions, who had not accepted the Tribunal's theology and had maintained the older forms of ancestor worship, kept the prophecy alive. The Tribunal temple called it heresy. The dissident priests within the temple believed it anyway. Generations of would-be Nerevarines appeared. I attempted to fulfill the prophecy and failed. Became what the tradition calls the failed incarnates, whose ghosts linger in the cavern of the incarnate as a record of everyone who tried and was not the one. In 3E 427, Emperor Uriel Septim VII, whose rule would soon end in the Oblivion crisis, but who had other concerns first, sent a prisoner to Morrowind, not for any obviously prophetic reason. He sent this prisoner because, in a vision, the Emperor had seen that this person should be there. The prisoner arrived on the island of Vvardenfell. They received the Emperor's cryptic directions. They began slowly to understand what they were there to do. The fulfillment of the prophecy. The Nerevarines' journey across Vvardenfell is one of the great stories in Elder Scrolls lore, and summarizing it risks losing the specific texture of what makes it extraordinary. But the shape of what happened is this. An outsider arrived in Morrowind with no knowledge of local politics, history, or theology. They were told, gradually, by a sequence of sources that included both enemies and allies, that they might be the reincarnation of a great Chimera hero who had died at the Battle of Red Mountain, that the prophecy attached to this possibility required them to unite the great Dwemer houses, unite the Ashlander tribes, and then go to Red Mountain and do something about Dagoth. The player character of Morrowind is the only protagonist in the main Elder Scrolls series who achieves something genuinely cosmological by the game's end. The other Dragonborns, in Daggerfall, in Oblivion, in Skyrim, accomplish extraordinary things. But the Nerevarine does something that had never been done before and has not been done since. They sever the connection between Lorkhan's divine heart and the beings who were drawing power from it. To do this, they needed Kagranak's tools, Wraithguard, which protected its wearer from the heart's power, Sunda, which could strike the heart and make it accessible, Keening, which could disrupt its tonal patterns. They also met in the Corpusarium of Telfir, the only living Dwemer, Yagrum Bargan, enormous and deformed by the Corpus disease, who had been in an outer realm when his people vanished and has been trying to understand what happened ever since. He could not tell the Nerevarine what became of his people. He helped anyway. And when the Nerevarine finally reached Dagoth in the heart chamber beneath Red Mountain, they spoke before they fought. Dagoth remembered Nerevar. He expressed what might be grief and what might be madness. The specific tone of a being who has been alone with divine power for centuries, who still understands what it meant to have a friend, and who has built an entire cosmological project around what was done to him. He offered the Nerevarine a place at his side. He was refused. The battle that followed could not be won by conventional means. Dagoth sustained by the heart, was effectively immortal. Each death simply returned him. What the Nerevarine did instead was what Vivek had told them to do. Use the tools to sever the heart's connection to everything that was drawing from it. Strike with Sunda. Strike with keening. Destroy not Dagoth Ur's body, but the enchantments that Kagranak had placed on the heart. The bindings that made the heart accessible to mortal beings. When the enchantments broke, Dagoth Ur lost his divine sustenance. The heart, dissipated across all of Nirn, was no longer accessible. Dagoth Ur, mortal again, was defeated. Aklakhan was destroyed. The blight ended, and the Tribunal became mortal. The fall of the Tribunal, 3 gods lost their divinity on the day the Nerevarine severed the heart. Dagoth Ur had been drawing from it. So had Vivek, Alessia, and Sothasil. Sothasil, the tinkerer, the philosopher god, who had spent centuries in isolation in his clockwork city, pursuing understanding of the mechanisms of reality, was murdered by Alessia before the Nerevarine arrived. She came to his city and killed her fellow god. The reasons for this are complex and speak to what centuries of diminishing divinity had done to a being who had once been magnificent. Alessia sent the Nerevarine to Sothasil's clockwork city afterward, telling them to investigate. What they found was the aftermath of the murder and eventually Alessia herself, whose divine loss had produced a specific kind of grief that had become something dangerous. She believed she was the true God, the real one, the only one who had truly understood what divinity meant. She had killed Sothasil because he was complicating the narrative. Vivek disappeared. The warrior poet, the most complicated of the Tribunal, simply was not present when the Nerevarine returned from the events of the Tribunal DLC. What happened to him? Whether he retreated into whatever passed for a mortal existence, or dissolved into the void, or something else entirely, is not confirmed. His disappearance had immediate physical consequences. Vivek City, the great Dwemer metropolis built around the Ministry of Truth, the enormous rock that Vivek had held frozen above the city for thousands of years through sheer divine power, lost its anchor when Vivek's power failed. In 4E5, the rock fell. The impact triggered a chain of disasters, the eruption of Red Mountain, floods, ashfalls, earthquakes. The event became known as the Red Year, and it effectively ended Morrowind as a functioning province for a generation. The Argonians, seeing opportunity in the chaos, invaded. The Dunmerry people dispersed to Skyrim, to Solstheim, whatever settlements elsewhere would have them. The temple was rebuilt around the reclamations, the return to the old Daedric patrons that the Tribunal had displaced, Azura, Boethia, Mephala. What had been heresy became orthodoxy again. Morrowind in the Third Era. The broader picture. The events of the main Morrowind game take place in 3, E427. The Oblivion crisis, the next great catastrophe, begins in 3, E433, only 6 years later. What the two events share is that both involve the specific relationship between mortal Tamriel and what lies beyond it. The heart of Lorkhan on one side, the Daedric plains of Oblivion on the other. The Elder Scrolls lore does not frame these proximities as coincidence. The specific period at the end of the Third Era is one in which the protections that Alessia and Tiber Septim had put in place, the covenant with Akatosh, the Dragonfires, the Amulet of Kings, were approaching the end of their effective lifespan, not because anyone had failed to maintain them, but because what sustained them was running thin. The Septim bloodline, which the Covenant required to hold the throne, was about to end. The dragon fires, which the presence of a legitimate dragonborn emperor kept burning, were about to go out. And when the fires went out, what had been prevented for nearly 3,000 years would finally come through. Sleep well. The great crisis is nearly upon Tamriel. There is one more part of the Third Era to understand before it arrives. Welcome back. Let everything slow. The mythic dawn and the plan that was always coming. The mythic dawn did not begin with the assassination of Uriel Septim VII. They had existed for generations. A secretive cult devoted to Mehrunes Dagon, the Daedric prince of destruction and change, whose theology held that Tamriel was rightfully Dagon's realm, and that the mortal world was simply a plane of oblivion that had forgotten its proper master. Their leader, Mankar Cameron, was a sophisticated and dangerous figure, an Ultima wizard who had spent decades building an organization designed to carry out a specific plan at a specific moment. The plan required two things to happen in sequence: the assassination of the Emperor and all his legitimate heirs, and the theft of the Amulet of Kings. With the dragon blood bloodline extinguished and the amulet removed, the covenant between Akatosh and Alessia would collapse. The dragon fires would go out, and without the dragon fires burning, the barrier that prevented large-scale Daedric incursion from Oblivion into Tamriel would fall. Uriel Septim VII knew something was coming. He had been receiving prophetic dreams for years. He had also, more practically, hidden a secret. He had an illegitimate son, Martin, whom he had placed with the Blades in secret, whom almost no one knew existed. Martin Septim grew up knowing nothing of his parentage, eventually becoming a priest of Akatosh in the city of Kvatch. He was there when everything began. The assassination. The mythic dawn struck in 433. Their agents infiltrated the White Gold Tower and attacked the Emperor's party. The Blades fought them off long enough for Uriel to escape through a secret passage. A passage that led through the dungeons of the Imperial prison. In one of the cells, there was a prisoner. The prisoner had been there for reasons lost to history. Uriel Septim VII looked at this prisoner and, for reasons he either could not or would not explain, gave them the Amulet of Kings and told them to carry it to safety. Then he was killed by the last of the assassins. This is the opening of the Elder Scrolls 4, Oblivion, and it is one of the more remarkable openings in gaming. A protagonist with no name, no history, and no stated qualities, given a divine artifact by a dying emperor who believes they matter. The specific quality of Uriel's trust, his certainty that the person he was looking at was the right person, for reasons he attributed to prophecy, frames everything that follows. The prisoner emerged from the sewers into the light of Cyrodiil. Oblivion gates had already begun to open. The Daedra were already moving. The crisis. What the Oblivion crisis looked like from the inside was chaos. Across the entirety of Tamriel, every province, every city, every settlement, gates to Mehrunes Dagon's realm of the Deadlands tore open and disgorged Daedra into the mortal world. The specific logic of the crisis was structural. Each gate that opened weakened the barrier further. Each Daedra that emerged reinforced the breach. If the process continued long enough, the barrier would collapse entirely, and Nirn and Oblivion would merge. The ultimate outcome that the mythic Dawn had been working toward. The city of Kvatch was the first to fall. Entirely, completely. Not simply besieged, but annihilated. Its population mostly dead. The great gate in front of its walls still pouring Aedra into the ruins. Martin Septim survived inside the chapel of Akatosh with the other refugees, having barricaded themselves in and waited. When the hero of Kvatch arrived and closed the gate, fighting into Oblivion itself and pulling out the sigil stone that anchored it to Tamriel, Martin was still alive. He did not yet know who he was. The process of discovering Martin's identity, of convincing him to accept the responsibility he had not chosen, of building the coalition capable of fighting back against a Daedric invasion, is the structure of Oblivion's main quest. Of what matters for the timeline is the shape of what was happening. A man who had never wanted power, who had become a priest specifically to live a small and meaningful life, gradually accepting that the world's continuation depended on him in particular, for reasons he could not have earned or expected. The mythic Dawn had the Amulet of Kings. Mankar Cameron had taken it to his personal realm of paradise, a pocket dimension within Oblivion, where it would remain beyond the reach of anyone who needed it. Martin decoded the Mysterium Xarxes, the sacred book of the mythic Dawn, written by Dagon himself, at significant cost to his sanity, and found a way to create a portal to paradise. The hero of Kvatch entered paradise and killed Mankar Cameron. They brought back the Amulet of Kings. Martin's sacrifice. The plan was straightforward in conception. Martin would relight the dragonfires with the Amulet of Kings, restoring the covenant, sealing the barrier, ending the crisis. He was proclaimed emperor by the Elder Council. He prepared for the ceremony. Mehrunes Dagon did not wait. The Daedric prince himself crossed from Oblivion into Tamriel. Physically, personally, a being of divine Daedric power, manifesting in the mortal world in a form that made clear why the covenant had been necessary. He entered the imperial city. He fought his way toward the Temple of the One, where the dragonfires burned, and where Martin was preparing to restore what the mythic Dawn had broken. It was already too late to simply relight the fires. The barrier had been breached too completely by the time of Dagon's physical arrival. There was no longer a threshold to protect. Dagon was already inside it. Martin looked at the Amulet of Kings. He looked at what was in front of him. He shattered the Amulet of Kings. What happened when he did that? What the shattering of the divine artifact that was simultaneously the red diamond and the crystallized covenant between a god and a mortal meant in cosmological terms is described with characteristic Elder Scrolls ambiguity across multiple sources. What was visibly observable? Martin was transformed. He became an avatar of Akatosh, the dragon god of time in temporary physical form, a fire dragon of divine power that existed for the moments required to combat Mehrunes Dagon and drive him back into Oblivion. The Daedric Prince of Destruction was defeated. The invasion ended. The avatar of Akatosh became a stone statue in the Temple of the One. The statue remains there in the Fourth Era, in the ruins of the temple. Martin Septim is in it, in some sense. What sense that is, whether he achieved what Tiber Septim achieved, whether he became divine in his moment of sacrifice, whether he simply ceased to exist in any form except the stone monument, is something different sources interpret differently. What is not ambiguous: Martin Septim was the last of the Dragonblood bloodline. With his death, or transformation, or apotheosis, whatever the precise nature of what happened at the Temple of the One, the Septim dynasty was over. The covenant with Akatosh, which had protected Tamriel for nearly 3,000 years, was spent. The dragon fires were out forever. The amulet of kings was gone. The third era ended on that day. The fourth era began. The fourth era and the post-crisis world. Without the Septim bloodline, without the covenant, without the dragon fires, the empire that Tiber Septim had built began to fracture. The High Chancellor Okato, an Altmer who had served as the de facto ruler while the crisis unfolded, attempted to hold the empire together, but the specific authority that had made the Septim emperors more than simply powerful rulers was gone. The Black Marsh, which the Argonians had largely defended themselves during the crisis, using their connection to the histories of their homeland, declared independence and was not seriously contested. The Somerset Isles, the Altmer homeland, was seized by the Thalmor, the supremacist political faction that had been building power in Altmeri society for decades, who renamed the islands Alinor and expelled those Altmer who disagreed with their ideology. Okato was assassinated by the Thalmor in 4E22. The Stormcrown interregnum followed. Years of competing claimants, factional violence, and the kind of political chaos that always fills a power vacuum. A Colovian warlord named Titus Mede eventually seized the Ruby Throne, not by divine right or legitimate succession, but by force, becoming the first emperor of the Mede dynasty, an illegitimate dynasty in the sense that the Covenant's specific requirement of dragon blood was not met. The Mede dynasty was an empire without a covenant. The dragon fires were out. The specific metaphysical protection that Alessia had secured 3,000 years ago no longer operated. What remained was a political entity, a large, historically significant political entity, capable of governing and deploying military force and maintaining the infrastructure of civilization, but not the divinely protected institution that the Covenant had sustained. The Great War. In 4E171, the Aldmeri Dominion, the alliance of Altmer, Bosmer and Khajiit peoples organized under Thalmor dominance, declared war on the empire. Their pretext was the imperial refusal to ban the worship of Talos, which the Thalmor considered both a theological error and a political threat. Their actual reasons were more complex. The Thalmor believed the empire was weak, had been weakened by the Oblivion crisis, by the loss of the Covenant, or by the succession of increasingly ineffective rulers since Tiber Septim's dynasty ended. They also had theological objections that were genuine. Their position that Talos's divinity was false, that the worship of a human as a god was not merely heresy, but a specific affront to elven metaphysical tradition, was held sincerely by those among the Thalmor who thought about it, rather than simply using it as a political weapon. The Great War lasted until 4E175. It devastated both sides. Imperial City was sacked. The Empire's military capability was significantly reduced. The Aldmeri Dominion suffered comparable losses in some theatres. Neither side won decisively. The peace treaty, the white gold concordat reflected the military stalemate. The Empire agreed to ban the worship of Talos within Imperial territory, and the Thalmor agreed to stop advancing. Everyone officially called it a victory for their own side. The specific clause banning Talos worship was, in Skyrim, the fault line along which the Stormcloak rebellion formed. Ulfric Stormcloak, a Jarl who believed passionately in Nordic independence and in the right to worship the god that he and his people had considered a divine ancestor for generations, found the Concordat intolerable. He killed the High King in ritual combat, using the voice. The Empire had him arrested, and the civil war that had been building for 30 years became open conflict. This is where Skyrim begins. The return of Alduin. The hero of Kvatch had closed the Oblivion crisis. The Nerevarine had ended the Tribunal's age. But there was a third great unresolved matter that had been waiting, dormant, and since the end of the Dragon War thousands of years ago. Alduin, the World Eater, the first and most powerful of the dragons, who had been cast forward in time rather than destroyed by the tongues at the end of the Dragon War, had arrived in the current era. The dragons were returning, not as the dragon cult servants, but as free and violent presences reclaiming a world that had forgotten them for 3,000 years. The Thu'um, which the Greybeards maintained as a sacred discipline on the throat of the world, was suddenly relevant again in ways that the Fourth Era had not anticipated, and a prisoner was taken to Helgen for execution. Not because they were important, because they were in the wrong place. And the dragon that attacked Helgen at the execution would determine whether this particular prisoner died there or became something else. It attacked, and the prisoner, in the chaos of the attack, survived. And when they later encountered another dragon and found themselves absorbing its power, its very soul, the watching Nords named what they were seeing Dovahkiin, Dragonborn, the specific quality that Alessia had possessed, that Raymond had possessed, that Tiber Septim had possessed, the innate connection to the dragon god of time that allowed a mortal to absorb a dragon's soul and use the voice as a natural capacity rather than a learned skill. A new one had appeared, in the middle of a civil war, in a province already unstable from the Great War's aftermath, at exactly the moment when Alduin was waking the ancient dragon burial mounds and rebuilding an army of resurrected dragons. The timeline of the Elder Scrolls does not present these coincidences as coincidences. Sleep well. The story of Skyrim is only beginning. We are nearly at the end of what is known, and nearly at what comes after. Welcome back. Let your breathing slow. The prisoner at Helgen. In 4E201, a prisoner was being transported to the execution ground at Helgen in Skyrim. They had been caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, swept up in an imperial ambush targeting Ulfric Stormcloak, the Jarl of Windhelm whose killing of High King Torrig had started the civil war. The prisoner had nothing to do with any of it. They were simply there, at the execution block, before the axe could fall. A dragon attacked Helgen. This was not an ordinary dragon. This was Alduin, the World Eater, the firstborn of Akatosh, the being who had been cast forward through time by an Elder Scroll at the end of the Dragon War thousands of years ago. returned at last to the era that had been waiting for him. He destroyed Helgen with fire, and the storm his voice summoned and flew away north. The prisoner escaped in the chaos. When they later killed a dragon near Whiterun and found themselves absorbing its soul, not simply standing over a defeated enemy, but taking into themselves the specific divine essence that made a dragon what it was, the watching Nords had a word for what they were seeing. The word was Dovahkiin, Dragonborn. The capacity to absorb a dragon's soul and use its power was the innate quality that had distinguished Alessia, Raymond, and Tiber Septim. It appeared again now, in an unnamed prisoner who had been seconds from death when Alduin's return inadvertently saved them. The Greybeards, the masters of the voice on the throat of the world, heard the new Dragonborn use the Thu'um and called them to High Hrothgar. The summons of the Greybeards is one of the most sacred things in Nordic tradition. No one had received it in generations. The Civil War. The Skyrim Civil War, which the Dragon Crisis overlapped entirely, was not simply a political disagreement about Imperial versus Nordic authority. It was a conflict over the specific clause of the White Gold Concordat that banned the worship of Talos. Ulfric Stormcloak believed with genuine passion that the worship of Talos, of Tiber Septim, the human general who had united Tamriel and been elevated to divinity, was the specific expression of Nordic identity and Nordic faith that the Thalmor were trying to destroy. His killing of High King Torig, using the voice to defeat him in ritual combat, was a deliberate political act meant to force the issue. The Empire's position was more pragmatic and more painful. The Concordat had saved the Empire from a war it was losing. Banning Talos worship was wrong. Many in the Empire agreed. But the alternative was a continued war that might destroy what remained of imperial governance entirely. The Thalmor wanted the civil war to continue regardless of who won it, because a divided Skyrim served their purposes. Ulfric did not know this. The Thalmor had carefully managed information to keep the civil war productive for their interests. The Dragonborn moved through this conflict. They chose sides or avoided choosing. They closed Oblivion gates that were not Oblivion gates, but dragon attacks. They learned the language of creation from Paarthurnax. Alduin's own brother, who had betrayed his kind to teach humanity the voice thousands of years ago, and had been sitting atop the throat of the world ever since, meditating on the specific challenge of not using power simply because you have it. And they followed Alduin's trail, Alduin's wall and the knowledge of the past. At Skyhaven Temple, an Akaviri structure built in the First Era, maintained by the Blades, there is a wall, Alduin's Wall, a mural carved in the era of Riemann Cyrodiil that depicts the entire prophecy of the Last Dragonborn's confrontation with the World Eater in visual form. The Akaviri had been searching for Dragonborn throughout their history. It was why they had invaded Tamriel in the First Era, why they had sworn fealty to Raymond when they recognized him. They knew the prophecy. They knew what the dragon's return would require, and they had carved it into stone and built a temple around it, so that whoever came after would have the knowledge when the moment arrived. The wall showed the Dragon War. It showed Alduin's defeat, and it showed the Last Dragonborn, whose specific identity the wall could not provide, but whose existence it confirmed. standing against the World Eater when he returned. What the Dragonborn needed, the wall told them, was a specific shout. Dragonrend, the shout that the ancient tongues had created at the end of the Dragon War. The words that forced the dragon to experience the concept of mortality, that grounded them by making them feel what they could not otherwise feel. It was not stored in any word wall. It had never been written down. The only way to learn it was to find the moment when the ancient tongues had used it, preserved in an Elder Scroll. The Dragonborn went to the throat of the world with an Elder Scroll and looked into the past. They saw the three heroes. They saw Alduin. They saw Dragonrend spoken for the first time in history. And in seeing it, they learned it. The specific mechanism of the Elder Scroll allowed the Dragonborn to be present at a moment that had already happened, to witness and absorb a shout that had been created before their own existence. The battle at the throat of the world. Alduin appeared. Paarthurnax, who had been watching and waiting, who had made his peace with what his brother had become, faced him. The dialogue between the two ancient dragons, before the Dragonborn intervened, before the battle began, is one of the quieter and more affecting moments in Skyrim, and two beings who had known each other before humans existed, who had fought on opposite sides of the Dragon War, who had each made choices that defined everything afterward, meeting on the mountain that one of them had made his home for thousands of years. Paarthurnax called Alduin too late. Alduin called Paarthurnax a traitor. The Dragonborn used Dragonrend. The shout grounded Alduin, forced him to feel mortality, made him vulnerable in a way that his divine nature otherwise prevented. They fought. Alduin was hurt. And then he escaped, fled to Sovngarde, the Nordic afterlife, to feed on the souls of the heroic dead and rebuild his strength beyond the reach of anyone in the mortal world. The Dragonborn captured Oblivion, Alduin's lieutenant, and forced information from him. And the only way to reach Sovngarde was through a portal at the ancient temple of Skuldafn, accessible only by dragon. Oblivion, whose loyalty to Alduin had been shaken by witnessing Alduin flee rather than fight, agreed to carry the Dragonborn there. Sovngarde and the end of Alduin. Sovngarde is the realm of Aetherius, where Nordic heroes go after death. The specific paradise that the worship of Shor promised, a great hall of feasting and battle, and the company of those who fought well. It is a beautiful place. When the Dragonborn arrived, it was beautiful and also terrible. Alduin had shrouded it in mist and was hunting through the fog for the souls of the dead to consume. A living person in Sovngarde. A Dragonborn chasing the World Eater into the afterlife. The Nordic tradition had stories about heroes who went to extraordinary places, but this was specific and unprecedented. Someone crossing from the mortal world into the realm of the dead, not to stay, but to fight what had made itself at home there. The three ancient tongues were there, Feldir the Old, Hakon One-Eye, and Gormlaith Golden Hilt, who had defeated Alduin at the end of the Dragon War, and who had been in Sovngarde ever since. They had been waiting, in the tradition of Sovngarde, for the moment when they could fight again. When Alduin returned, they understood why they had been kept. Together, the three ancient heroes and the last Dragonborn, they cleared Alduin's mist with the clear sky's shout. And Alduin denied the cover he had been using to pick off souls without facing opposition, had no choice but to fight. The battle was 4 against 1. 4 voices using the Thu'um, 4 fighters pressing an enemy who had no refuge left to flee to, in the specific environment of the afterlife, where what matters is not physical strength, but the weight of what you represent. Alduin was defeated. His soul was not absorbed. The World Eater was not simply a dragon to be consumed, and his specific nature remained distinct even in defeat. Whether he was truly destroyed, whether his function as the World Eater, the being who existed to devour the world at the end of each age and make room for the next, had been permanently ended or simply postponed, is something the greybeard Arngir addressed when the Dragonborn returned. Perhaps Alduin was not permanently destroyed. Perhaps the gods would decide whether his role at the end of time still needed to be fulfilled. The world would have to wait and see. What was certain? Sovngarde was clear. The souls Alduin had been consuming were free. The dragon crisis was over. After the crisis, the dragons without Alduin were leaderless but not gone. Some submitted to Paarthurnax, who attempted to teach them the way of the voice, the philosophy he had adopted over thousands of years of meditation, the discipline of restraint. Some acknowledged the Last Dragonborn as the rightful authority, the one who had defeated their former lord. Some simply did as they wished, as beings of that age and power tend to do when the structure that organized them has been removed. The Blades wanted Paarthurnax killed. His crimes during the Dragon War, the specific atrocities he had committed before his change of heart, were, in their view, not offset by his subsequent service to humanity. The Dragonborn was presented with a choice that the game does not resolve canonically. Kill the one who made everything possible, in the name of justice for what he had done before everything became possible. Or refuse. Neither outcome is canon. Paarthurnax's fate remains officially undetermined, which is the correct treatment of a choice too significant to resolve in either direction without losing something important. The civil war continued. The Thalmor watched from their embassies. The Empire held on. The specific shape of what came next, whether the Stormcloaks won and Skyrim gained independence, or the Empire held and the White Gold Concordat's humiliations continued, was also left unresolved. What the Dragon Crisis added to the Fourth Era was a Dragonborn who was not an emperor, not someone whose divine quality was expressed through governance and the Covenant and the Dragonfires. A person, unnamed and unremarkable before Helgen, who simply had the specific capacity and was in the right place when it mattered. The long tradition of Dragonborn in Elder Scrolls history, from Alessia receiving the Amulet of Kings, to Riemann unifying the Akaviri invasion, to Tiber Septim completing the continent's conquest, ended with someone who had no title and no throne, just a voice, and the soul of a dragon, and a world that needed both. Miraak and the first Dragonborn. There is one more piece of the Dragon Crisis that the main quest of Skyrim does not address. Miraak. Miraak was the first Dragonborn in history. Before Alessia, before any of the Imperial succession, before the Dragon War had been won, Miraak had been a dragon priest, the greatest of them, whose specific capacity as Dragonborn he had used not in service of the dragons, but against them. He had been the first mortal to turn the voice against the beings whose language it was, He did not fight Alduin at the end of the Dragon War. He refused when the Three Tongues asked for his help. What he was doing instead, what had kept him separate from the conflict, what had led him eventually to Solstheim and the word wall there, and the connection to the Daedric prince Hermaeus Mora that had preserved him for thousands of years in Apocrypha, was pursuing power for its own sake. Knowledge, the specific hoarding of capability that characterizes those who serve Hermaeus Mora. When the last Dragonborn absorbed enough dragon souls to attract his attention, Miraak began to exert his influence. The Dragonborn DLC is the story of the confrontation between the first and last of the Dragonborn, beings who share a specific quality in an era when that quality has become relevant again, one of whom has spent thousands of years in service to a Daedric prince accumulating power, and one of whom has spent the last several months of their life fighting to save a world they stumbled into by accident. Or the confrontation in Apocrypha resolves in the last Dragonborn's favour, in part because Hermaeus Mora betrays Miraak at the critical moment. Using the Dragonborn as a tool to eliminate a servant who had outlived his usefulness in the specific way that Daedric princes tend to regard their followers. Miraak's soul was absorbed by the last Dragonborn, the first Dragonborn, taken into the last. Sleep well. The known history of Tamriel approaches its end. One more part remains before we reach the edge of what is known. Welcome back. Let everything slow. The end of what is known. The events of the Elder Scrolls 5. Skyrim represent the furthest point in the timeline that the games have explored in detail. Beyond 4, E201. The year of Alduin's return and defeat. The year of the Dragon Crisis. The Elder Scrolls lore becomes deliberately sparse. The Civil War's resolution is not canonically determined. The fate of Paarthurnax is not canonically determined. The shape of what the Fourth Era becomes after these events is not something Bethesda has filled in. This is intentional. Every Elder Scrolls game begins in a specific place at a specific time with a prisoner. What happened before that moment is lore. What happens after is the story the next game will tell. The space between Skyrim and whatever comes next is being held open. What we know of the broader Fourth Era can be assembled from the Skyrim's own background texts, from the timeline that runs forward from the Oblivion crisis, and from the few hints that later events will require the world to have been in a certain state. But much of it is deliberately absent. Let us gather what is known. The Thalmor and the Long Game, the Aldmeri Dominion, the alliance of Altmer, Bosmer and Khajiit, organized under Thalmor leadership, is the dominant political force of the Fourth Era that no one in Tamriel has fully confronted. The Great War weakened both the Empire and the Dominion, but the specific damage was asymmetric in ways that matter long term. The Empire lost territory, military capacity, and the specific moral authority that comes from governing without compromising. Southern White Gold Concordate's ban on Talos worship was experienced across the Empire, but especially in Skyrim, as a humiliation. Every Imperial soldier who enforced the ban on a faithful Nord worshipper was a soldier demonstrating that the Empire would sacrifice its people's beliefs to preserve its political existence. The Thalmor did not experience this as loss. the white gold concordat gave them exactly what they wanted: formal imperial acknowledgement that their theological position on Talos was accepted, at least officially. The Thalmor believe, or claim to believe, that Talos's divinity is false, and that the covenant of Akatosh was a manipulation, and that the specific metaphysical structure of Mundus depends on undoing the apotheosis that made Tiber Septim divine. Whether they are right about this is one of the most consequential unresolved questions in Elder Scrolls lore. Their argument is sophisticated. The counter-argument that Talos is genuinely divine, that his worship has genuine metaphysical weight, that the Thalmor's position is motivated more by elven supremacism than by theological accuracy, is also sophisticated. The lore holds both simultaneously. What is certain, the Thalmor's power has been increasing throughout the Fourth Era. Their agents operate across Imperial territory. Their embassy in Skyrim conducts surveillance on Imperial citizens. They have internal documents confirming that they benefit from the Skyrim civil war continuing regardless of outcome. They are playing a long game whose end goal is the dismantling of an empire they regard as an offense against the proper order of the world. The proper order, in their view, is elven supremacy. Not because elves are simply better at things, though the Thalmor would claim this too, but because of a specific cosmological position. The Aldmeri theological tradition holds that the creation of Mundus was a catastrophe, that the Aedra who contributed to it lost something they should not have lost, and that the correct goal of existence is the undoing of that catastrophe, the return to the pre-creation state, the dissolution of mortality back into the divine. If this cosmological goal sounds familiar, it is because it echoes the Dwemer's project, the attempt to transcend the mortal world rather than inhabit it. And the Thalmor's theology and the Dwemer's philosophy are not the same, but they share a root: the conviction that what Lorkhan made was wrong, and that the correct response to that wrongness is to undo it. What undoing it would mean for every mortal being who currently exists in the world they would be dissolving is not something the Thalmor's theology addresses with satisfaction. The Empire, without a covenant. The Fourth Era. Empire is in a different metaphysical position than any previous empire in Tamrielic history. The covenant with Akatosh, the agreement that Alessia made, that the Septim bloodline maintained, that protected Tamriel from large-scale Daedric incursion, is gone. Martin's sacrifice at the Temple of the One ended it. The dragon fires are out permanently. The Amulet of Kings is destroyed, and the barrier that replaced it, the one Martin's sacrifice created in his final act, is described as extraordinarily strong, stronger than the original, strong enough that even a sigil stone, in the presence of which 1,000 soul gems would dissolve, cannot breach it for more than moments. The Daedra cannot enter Tamriel as they did during the Oblivion crisis. But this is not the same as the Covenant. The Covenant was an ongoing relationship, a living agreement between a divine entity and a mortal bloodline, renewed by the presence of dragonborn emperors and burning dragon fires. What replaced it is a wall, strong, permanent, but static. It does not grow stronger with use. It does not have the organic quality of a covenant maintained by the faith of those who live under it. The Mede dynasty which rules without dragon blood and without divine covenant, governs a large and historically significant political entity that is fundamentally more vulnerable than what preceded it. Not immediately, not in ways that most of its citizens would notice day to day, but structurally. The protection that sustained the Imperium for 3,000 years is gone, and what has replaced it is the same kind of protection that everything in Tamriel has always needed: sufficient military force, political coherence, and the willingness of the gods to continue caring about what happens to the people below. The Last Dragonborn's place in history. The Last Dragonborn, whoever they were before Helgen, whatever their name and race and history, occupies a specific place in the pattern of Dragonborn across Elder Scrolls history. Each previous Dragonborn was connected to the Covenant in a specific way. Alessia established it, Raymond embodied it, Tiber Septim completed it and became divine through it, and the Septim Emperors sustained it. The quality of dragon blood was always associated with governance, with the right and the responsibility to hold the ruby throne and keep the dragon fires burning. The Last Dragonborn has no throne. They were a prisoner. The covenant they are associated with is not one they established or sustained. It is one that had already ended before they appeared. Their Dragonborn quality is expressed not through governance, but through the specific combat against Alduin and whatever comes after. What comes after for the Last Dragonborn is not written. They are alive at the end of Skyrim's main quest, wherever the Civil War resolution placed them politically, having dealt with Alduin and Miraak and whatever other crises they addressed. Their presence in Tamriel's future, whether they become a figure like Tiber Septim, building something institutional, or whether they recede back into the anonymous existence that most people live, is not determined. The Elder Scrolls are specific about some Dragonborn and silent about others. The Last Dragonborn may be remembered as the slayer of Alduin, or they may be a figure about whom subsequent eras know very little. History in Tamriel is not reliable, and persons without institutional power frequently disappear from it. The towers and what they mean for what comes next. One of the deepest structural elements of Elder Scrolls lore, the towers, which were built to anchor the reality of Mundus and prevent the chaos of the Dawn era from reasserting itself, has been quietly accumulating damage across the eras covered by the games. The Adamantine Tower, the oldest, the one built at the Convention, still stands on Balfira Island in High Rock. Its stone, the Convention itself, still holds. The Red Tower, Red Mountain in Morrowind, lost its stone when the Nerevarine severed Lorkhan's heart from the world. The eruption of Red Mountain following Vivek's disappearance and the fall of Bardal was, in this reading, not simply a geological event. It was a tower losing its stone. The specific stability of reality that Red Mountain's presence had been anchoring since the Convention was disrupted. The White Gold Tower, the Imperial City's central structure, lost its specific function in the Oblivion crisis when Martin's sacrifice destroyed the Amulet of Kings, which had been connected to the Red Diamond, the tower's stone. The Empire still controls the tower, but the relationship between the tower and what it was sustaining may have changed in ways that are not immediately visible. Crystal-like lore, the Crystal Tower of the Ultima on Somerset Isle, was destroyed during the Oblivion crisis when Daedric forces attack the Isles. Each tower that falls or loses its stone is a weakening of the specific structure that stabilizes reality in Tamriel. The Dawn Era's chaos was ended by the towers. As the towers are diminished, the specific quality of settled, linear, stable time becomes more fragile. Whether this is what the Thalmor want, whether the dissolution of Mundus back into the pre-creation state that their theology calls for requires the towers to fall, is not stated directly, but the cosmological logic is there. What lies beyond the known? The Elder Scrolls series has been building across its entire history towards something that the games have never directly shown: the end of the current Kalpa and the beginning of the next. The Kalpas are the cycles of orbic existence, each one a period in which Mundus exists, in which history happens, in which mortals live and die and build civilizations, before Alduin completes his function as World Eater, and the cycle ends. The current Kalpa is not the first. The cosmological history of the Elder Scrolls contains references to previous Kalpas, previous versions of the world, previous cycles of creation and destruction. Alduin's defeat by the Last Dragonborn was, in the Greybeard Arngir's reading, a postponement rather than a cancellation. Alduin may have been weakened, dispersed, denied his feast in Sovngarde, but his function in the cosmic order is to devour the world at the end of each age. Whether the gods will allow him to eventually fulfill that function, or whether his defeat represents something genuinely new in the history of the Kalpas, is not something any being in the mortal world can confidently answer. What is suggested by the accumulated lore is that the Elder Scrolls universe is moving toward a transition, that the events of the games, taken together, represent the specific series of catastrophes and revelations that precede the end of something. The covenant is broken, and the towers are damaged. The Septim bloodline is gone. The protections that sustained the current age have been removed one by one. What replaces them? What the world looks like in the next Kalpa, if there is one, or what the transition to a post-mortal state of existence means for those who are alive when it happens, is the question the series has been building toward. This is what the Elder Scrolls are for. The Elder Scrolls, the documents themselves, the prophetic texts in the libraries of Tamriel that no mortal can read without going blind, record possible futures. They show what might happen in all its contradictory simultaneity. The scrolls are not one thing, but many things, and reading them requires a specific kind of perception that ordinary mortal minds cannot sustain. What they record about what comes after Skyrim, after the Last Dragonborn, after the Fourth Era, no mortal currently in Tamriel knows. The scrolls see it. They simply cannot tell us. Sleep well. One final part remains. The last things and what they all mean. Welcome back. This is the last part. The shape of the story. We have travelled a long distance tonight, from the void before the void, where Anu and Padomay existed without anything else existing, through the birth of the Aedra and the creation of Mundus, and the sacrifice of the Aedra, who gave themselves to make the world, through the Dawn Era, where time did not work, and the convention at the Adamantine Tower, and the shooting of Lorkhan's heart across the world, through the long darkness of the Merethic Era, the Aldmer arriving in Tamriel, the splitting of the elves into their different peoples, the Dragon War, the Night of Tears, the first human foothold in a land that had belonged to elves. Through the Dwemer and their extraordinary project, their discovery of Lorkhan's heart, their building of the brass god, and their simultaneous vanishing from the world on the day of the Battle of Red Mountain. Through the Tribunal taking divinity for themselves, the transformation of the Chimer into the Dunmer, the 3,000 years of Morrowind's divine governance, and Dagoth Ur's patient return from beneath the mountain. Through the Alessian rebellion and the founding of the first human empire, Raymond Cyrodiil and the Akaviri, Tiber Septim's conquest and apotheosis, through the Oblivion crisis and Martin Septim's sacrifice, through the Dragon crisis and the Last Dragonborn's journey to Sovngarde and back, the whole of it, from before beginning to the edge of what is known. What does it all mean? What is the Elder Scrolls trying to tell us? Across decades of accumulated lore and multiple games and thousands of in-world texts. The dream. One of the deepest concepts in Elder Scrolls philosophy, encountered in the most esoteric texts, in the writings attributed to Vivek, in the most difficult to pass lore documents that the most dedicated readers find, is the idea that Mundus is a dream, not metaphorically. The lore engages seriously with the possibility that the mortal world, Nirn, Tamriel, all the civilizations and conflicts and histories we have followed tonight, exists within a consciousness, the Godhead, an entity whose nature cannot be described in terms that the beings within the dream can access, because any description would itself be part of the dream. In this reading, all of existence, the Aedra, the Daedra, the mortals, the towers, are the Kalpas, is the content of a dream being dreamed by something that has no name accessible to those who exist within it. The Atada are thoughts. The mortal world is a specific kind of thought. The kind that forgets it is a thought and believes itself to be real. This is where the concept of Chim appears. Chim, pronounced with a specific resonance, one of those in-world concepts that the law treats with great seriousness, is the state of realizing that you exist within the Godhead's dream while continuing to exist. Most beings who approach this realization either collapse into the dream entirely, losing all individuality, or are simply dissolved by the weight of what they have understood. CHIM is the third option. Realizing that the dream is a dream, that you are a thought within a consciousness, and choosing to remain individual anyway, maintaining selfhood in the face of the knowledge that selfhood is a construction. Tiber Septim is said to have achieved CHIM. It is offered as an explanation for his apotheosis, not simply that he conquered the continent, not simply that Numidium elevated him, but that his specific relationship to the nature of existence produced a state in which divinity was the natural consequence. The Dwemer may have been pursuing something adjacent to this. Their project, the refusal to worship the gods, the attempt to understand and transcend the nature of reality, the building of Numidium, can be read as an attempt to realize the dream nature of existence and step outside it. Whether they succeeded, or whether their simultaneous disappearance was dissolution into the Godhead, or transcendence into a state beyond the dream, or simply annihilation, is one of the questions the law holds open. What Lorkhan did, the creation of Mundus, the event that produced everything, that brought the mortal world into being at the cost of the Aedra who participated, looks different in the light of the dream. Lorkhan, the Padomay spirit of change, who convinced or tricked the Aedra into creating the mortal plane, was not simply doing what he wanted. He was doing what the Godhead's dream required. In the logic of a universe where all existence is the content of a consciousness dreaming itself, the creation of a realm where the divine can forget what it is and experience the specific texture of limitation and mortality was a necessary step. And the Aedra, who are furious at Lorkhan, who judged him at the convention, who shot his heart across the world, who have structured their cosmological position around his guilt, may be furious at the instrument of a process that was always going to happen. Whether Lorkhan deceived them or led them is not the most important question. The most important question is what the creation of Mundus made possible. What it made possible? Everything. Every mortal life. Every act of love and cruelty and creativity. Every war and every peace. Every prayer and every heresy. Every dragon war and every great empire. Every prisoner who escaped a cell and became something unexpected. Every god who walked among their people. Every civilization that built something that lasted longer than the people who built it. The mortals who inhabit Mundus are the specific form that divine consciousness takes when it forgets it is divine and discovers what limitation produces. They create things because they have to, because the world they live in resists them. They make art and war and family and religion and magic because existing in a world that does not simply yield to them forces the specific creativity that unlimited divine power would never require. This is what Lorkhan gave the Aedra in the reading that is most sympathetic to him. The experience of being finite and all the extraordinary things that finitude produces. The many names of the same God. Across the cultures of Tamriel, the major divine figures appear under different names. Akatosh is the dragon god of time to the Imperials. Ori-El to the Aldmer and their descendants, Alduin to certain Nordic traditions. Lorkhan is Shor to the Nords, Shazar to the Imperials, Sept to the Red Guards. The Daedric Prince Boethia appears differently to the Dunmer than to the Bretons. The Elder Scrolls lore is deliberately structured so that different cultures have access to partial, culturally shaped versions of the same entities. The Nine Divines are not objectively different from the Nordic pantheon. They are the same beings understood through different interpretive frameworks, each framework capturing something true, while also imposing the specific biases of the civilization doing the understanding. This is not relativism. The lore does not suggest that all interpretations are equally accurate, but it does suggest that the divine, as it exists in the Elder Scrolls universe, exceeds any single cultural framework's ability to capture it completely. The Aldmer worship Ori-El as the first spirit to experience time and the one who will end it. The Nords venerate Alduin as the World Eater, who will consume the current age and make room for the next. Both are describing the same being from different perspectives, and neither is entirely wrong. The mortals of Tamriel are trying to understand something too large for their understanding, and producing theology as the result. The theologies conflict. They are also, each of them, gesturing at something real. what the Elder Scrolls are? The Elder Scrolls, the documents that give the series its name, appear throughout the games as prophetic texts of extraordinary power. Reading one causes blindness in an unprepared person, and the moth priests who specialize in their interpretation go blind over years of study. The scrolls show possible futures and past events simultaneously in ways that resist linear interpretation. They are not books that were written. They emerged, or so the lore implies, as inherent features of the Orbis. Documents that exist because the existence of the universe implies the documentation of all that can happen within it. They are what a universe that runs on narrative produces when its narrative becomes self-aware enough to be recorded. What the scrolls record about the future of Tamriel, about what comes after the Dragon Crisis, after the Fourth Era, after the events of whatever Elder Scrolls 6 will depict, is accessible in principle to those who can read them. In practice, no one can fully read them without being destroyed by the reading. This is the appropriate condition for prophecy. The future is not hidden from Tamriel's inhabitants because it does not exist. It exists, written in documents that predate the events they describe. It is hidden because perceiving it fully is more than a mortal mind can hold while remaining mortal. The cycle and the question. Every Elder Scrolls game begins with a prisoner. The specific details vary: the cell, the crime, the empire, the era. But the structure is the same. Someone who has been reduced to the minimum is given the maximum responsibility by the intervention of something beyond their control. They emerge from confinement into a world that needs something from them that they could not have known they had. This is not simply a game design convention. It is a mythological structure that the Elder Scrolls has been using consistently enough that it constitutes a statement about what the games believe about people. The prisoner who becomes something extraordinary is not extraordinary because of what they already were. They are extraordinary because of what the world requires of them, and because they are available to meet that requirement in the specific moment when it arises. Alessia was a slave. Martin Septim was a priest. The Last Dragonborn was a prisoner. What made each of them significant was not what they started as, but what the world asked of them and what they chose to do with the asking. The Elder Scrolls, as a series, believes in the specific kind of heroism that emerges from limitation. Not the hero who was always going to be a hero, whose destiny was written in their blood from birth, though the lore has that too, the Dragonborn quality, the lineage requirements, but the hero who was not supposed to be one, who came from nothing and became whatever the moment required, who survived the gap between what they were and what the world needed them to be. Every prisoner who walks out of every cell in every Elder Scrolls game is that gap made into a person. The world that dreams itself. Tamriel is old. Its oldest structures predate the concept of recorded history. Its oldest events happened in a time when time itself did not work in the ways we can understand. The depth of its past is genuinely overwhelming if you try to hold all of it at once. The Dawn Era, the Merethic Era, the thousands of years of the First Era, the accumulated weight of everything that came after. But what it all amounts to is a world that is dreaming itself into existence one moment at a time, one mortal life at a time, one crisis and one resolution at a time. The Godhead dreams. The Aedra think. The mortal world exists in the specific space between divine infinity and mortal limitation, producing in that space all the things that limitation and mortality make possible. Beauty, cruelty, faith, heresy, creation, destruction, and the specific texture of caring about what happens next, because you will not be there forever. The Elder Scrolls series is a love letter to that space, to the mortal condition that Lorkhan produced, whatever his reasons, to the Tamriel that Alessia built from slavery and prayer, to the Dwemer, who carry in their grey skin the memory of a divine curse and made it a mark of distinction, to the Nords who shouted dragons out of the sky and built a mead hall culture around the pride of that achievement, to the Altmer who remember what they lost when the Aldmer became the many elven peoples and have never fully forgiven the world for the loss, to the prisoners who walked out of cells and found that the world had been waiting for them specifically. This has been the entire Elder Scrolls timeline, from before the beginning to the edge of the known, told slowly for the nights when sleep is close and the world outside is large and old. The scrolls are written. The towers stand, or they do not. The dream continues. Good night.